All right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to our session. My name is Tamara Starling. I am a Black mental wellness mentee, and I will be introducing the session and our speaker. Now, just before we get started, I do just want to mention some hop-in information. So, if you'd like to show our speaker some love and comment on some of the topics being discussed, feel free to use the chat option. So, it'll be on the right of your screen. You'll click the session tab and then chat to chat directly within this session. If you have questions for the speaker, again, just to your right, click session and then click Q&A. You'll see a blue button toward the bottom of the right side of your screen to ask a question. And then, of course, feel free to type in your question. We ask you to use the Q&A feature to ask your questions, just so your question doesn't get lost in the chat. Okay, so let's get into it. Our session today is On My Journey, Black Entrepreneurship. And our speaker is Dr. Traci Williams. Dr. Williams is a psychologist and certified financial therapist. She completed a doctorate in clinical psychology with specialized training in child, adolescent, and family psychology. She attained board certification in clinical psychology via the American Board of Professional Psychology, as well as certification in financial therapy through the Financial Therapy Association. Dr. Williams has over a decade of experience assessing and treating all age groups. For the past 6 years, she has held a faculty appointment at Emory University's School of Medicine, working with children and their caregivers at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. She is one of 2 financial psychologists in the Atlanta metro area. Dr. Williams has presented on a variety of mental health topics in professional settings, both nationally and internationally. Her social media platform, Healthy Wealthy Roots, provides information and guidance serving to improve families' emotional, mental, and financial health. Dr. Traci is a Trinidadian who calls Atlanta her second home. She has proudly been a fan of Beyonce since 2001, loves a good burger, and very literally chases waterfalls. Let us welcome to the stage Dr. Traci Williams.
Thank you so much. Please let me know if you're able to hear me. This is my first time being on the mic for the day. Okay, great. So thank you so much for the introduction. It saves me from having to introduce myself. I will add on to my bio just to share that I am not in private practice. I work at the Children's Hospital. I tend to get that question often. And I wanted to also make it clear that I don't have any conflicts of interest. I will be talking about money, but this is not personal financial advice or a replacement for financial planning or for your own therapy. As I go along, if questions come to mind, please feel free to leave them in the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen. And towards the end of the session, I will be more than happy to answer them. If you don't want to do that, my contact information will be at the end. So because we will be talking about race and money, those 2 topics can be very triggering and can result in very strong emotional reactions. And so this is going to be a reminder throughout the session. You will see this pop up as a reminder to breathe. When we are anxious or worked up, our brains think that we do not have enough oxygen, and then we feel even more anxious, and then we're not able to concentrate, and so on. So it's a reminder for us to take a deep breath in so that we can stay present in the moment. This is how today's session is going to go. I am going to give an ode to Nikki Giovanni, who is the author of the title of this presentation. And then we're going to talk about generational wealth. We will talk about the racial wealth gap, as well as what exactly is financial trauma, how do we heal from it, and how can we move forward and live financially healthy lives. I tend to have a lot of resources. And so I have a whole section just on resources. And then, like I mentioned, we'll have the Q&A at the end. So in Nikki Giovanni's work, what she did was she used the spirituals to talk about our triumph over adversity as Black people. And what I am doing in this presentation is I am using the hip hop and rap industry as a way for us to frame what we are working towards, which is financial health, as well as to acknowledge how we've gotten to where we are right now. Most recently, I would say in the past 2 to 3 years, I have seen a lot of information on social media, especially, and very much a big drive to creating and passing on generational wealth. If you've seen the same thing, or if that's of interest to you, please leave a message in the chat. Let me know. I want this to be interactional and I want to hear from you as I go along. So, what exactly is generational wealth? Essentially, it is being able to pass on assets from one generation to the next. And assets can be cash, it can be stocks, it can be bonds, it can be real estate, it can be a family business. The thing about passing on generational wealth, well, one, you have to have wealth to pass on, right? And two, in order to build wealth, you have to be in a good position yourself financially. Um, Parents often talk to me about wanting their children to have wealth. And I always mention to them, well, how are you doing financially? Are you together? Is your house together? It's kind of like that analogy on an airplane. Don't put on your child's mask first. You have to put on your mask first. And so I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about generational wealth. Ooh, Felicia, you said that you were just talking about this yesterday. Then this is right up your alley. Okay, so there are multiple ways to create and to transfer generational wealth, like I mentioned. If you pass away and you transfer an inheritance, that is one way. Hopefully, you're doing that transfer by having had in place a trust or a will. If not, your assets will go to probate court, your family will have to go, and it will be a whole long process to get whatever you are passing on to your family. Another way that you can do it while you're alive, you can pass on real estate. So, for instance, there are many families that I know of who helped their children with buying a home. They bought the home in their name, passed it on to the children, or an office space. You can also pass on stocks, and you can give gifts. You can give gifts of any of the above. You can pay for the next generation's education. Most commonly, that is done through 529 plans. And I love talking about 529s because they are a great wealth tool to people who have money. A 529, if you're not familiar, is an investment account that you can set up, and the beneficiary of the account would be your family member, a young family member, and that money can be invested in the stock market and can grow. And then your beneficiary can use that money specifically for education purposes. So paying for tuition, getting a laptop, and so on. What wealthy families do is they set up a 529 when they are pregnant or they've just had a baby. Anyone in the family, anyone in general, friends of the family can contribute to the 529. And so that money grows and eventually it can pay for things like private school or for college. Another way to do it is if you have a teenager who's already in college, who's in your family, you can help with paying for their tuition. That is another way to pass on generational wealth because you are reducing their eventual bill and it is setting them up for success. Another account that is not talked about nearly enough is the ABLE account. And that is similar to a 529, but it's specifically for people who have disabilities. These could be physical disabilities, developmental disabilities. And so, for instance, wealthy families with a child who has a disability, they set this up. The money grows in the stock market over time and can later be used for taking care of this family member when they need it down the road. You can also pass on generational wealth by paying your family members' medical expenses, whether it's in full or in part. Either way, you are helping them financially. And if we can reduce each other's bills, that sets us up for success. I mentioned transferring business ownership as well. And the thing when we're talking about estate planning, it is very useful to work with someone, to work with an estate planner to do this because state laws are complicated. I don't even consider myself to be an expert on estate planning because it is very confusing and there are so many different products and rules and but the reason why you want to work with someone is that one, they will know how to navigate the system, and two, they will be able to set up your estate in a way to reduce any possible tax bills that you may have from transferring wealth. You can't just give a large sum of money or give a business to someone and not have taxes on it unless you are protected by estate plan. And the other reason why to do formal estate planning is because, like I mentioned, if you don't and you pass away, the state laws will dictate who gets what. And also, you may have a large tax bill. So, if any of this was new, please mention it in the chat. I'm more than happy to talk more about it towards the end if you need any clarifications. The thing about having money is that it is directly related to how well we do, how well we do now, how well we do in the future, as well as the impact that it can have on the children in our family. There is a direct correlation between parents who have wealth and then their child's ability to have wealth in the future. It increases the child's likelihood of attending and graduating from college. And we know that if you have a college degree, then you are more likely to earn higher than someone who did not. It can so then increase the earnings that you make over your lifetime. And money is directly related to our physical and mental health. So that's why this topic is important because I feel like, particularly on social media, when I have seen people talking about generational wealth, the focus has been on the money and there's so much more to it. So I hope that this presentation helps to kind of tie that all together. I will pause when there are a lot of words on the screen just so that we can read and take it all in. I chose this quote in particular, these lyrics in particular, because it really drove home to me that we are fighting against a system that has been very oppressive for centuries. This is not a new issue, and it is really on us to pull ourselves together and to provide for the future generations to come. So there are a lot of words on this slide, but I want to take the time to break it down. When people talk about generational wealth, and when they talk about wealth in general, you will hear people say, oh, her net worth was XYZ. I'm a Beyonce fan, as you heard in my bio. And so I will reference Beyonce on a regular basis throughout this presentation. Please, no haters allowed. But just for example, if you heard, oh, Beyonce's net worth is $25 kajillion, that does not mean that Beyonce has $25 kajillion in cash in a bank somewhere. It does not mean that she has $25 kajillion worth of real estate somewhere. Your net worth is what you own minus what you owe. So what you own can be cash, property values, stocks. In Beyonce and Jay-Z's case, they also have art collections that has value. She talked about having her Birkins in storage. Those have value. So it is everything that you own minus your liabilities or what you owe. So your credit card balances, any loans, your car note, and so on. It's important to calculate your family's net worth, your net worth or your family's net worth, and to keep track of it because it is an indicator of your financial health. And the goal ultimately is to increase your net worth over time. So if we look on the right-hand side of the screen, I'm going to walk us through this. I really love this because, for one, Kitty Princess 1234 as a username always cracks me up every single time, and I have seen this picture tons and tons of times. But you can see that the breakdown for the assets for this person, they have a savings account, a checking account, and a Roth IRA. That's an individual retirement account. They also have a home, and the Zillow estimate or the Zestimate of that home is listed as their assets. In contrast to their assets, they have a student loan, they have the mortgage on the house, and they have a balance on their credit card. When you take away what they owe from what they own, this person's net worth score is minus 10,202. Now, if you have a net worth that is in the negatives, please do not despair. It does not mean that you are a bad person. It does not mean that you are doomed for the rest of your life. As you will see, and we'll talk about it in a little while, it is more common than you would think, particularly if you have college and grad school loans. And if you are feeling absolutely bummed about it, I will recommend on YouTube, there is a couple, the name of their channel is One Big Happy Life, I believe. And they are climbing out of minus $500,000 of debt. And so they would be a great resource for you to see that it is possible. So your net worth is not your own self-worth. And I want to make that very, very clear. So now that we understand net worth and exactly what it is, Beyonce's $25 kajillion just means that her assets versus what she owes, it balances out. And so she has that much money. Okay, let's move forward. The bad news is that the rich folks have a whole lot more money than all Black Americans combined. And for me, one of the reasons why I am motivated to do what I do is because I have realized, particularly over the last 2.5 years, that there is such a gap between what we know, what we have been taught, and what others know and what others have been taught. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. This slide talks about the racial wealth gap. So essentially, what that is, it's very self explanatory. There is a very big discrepancy between how much white families have and how much Black families have, Black and Brown families. When I mentioned previously to not feel terrible if you have a negative net worth, 19% of Black families have a negative net worth. And that is equal to 3.5 million American households in comparison to 8% of white families. And the US Treasury, in their most recent update about the racial wealth gap, talked about the fact that the discrepancy, the gap between our families and white families has not changed much over the last 20 years. And so you can see it on this graph here. I know that it's a little small, so I'll walk you through it. Down at the bottom, we have it starts at 1989 and it ends at 2019. The blue line up on top here, this is how much white households' net worth have increased over that time. And then this line is for other non Hispanic. So, for instance, Asian American families. And down at the bottom, we have Black and Hispanic Latino families. And so you can see that those lines are pretty flat. It also is tied into our home ownership. Like I mentioned in the beginning, having property is one way to amass wealth. And 76% of white families own a home versus 46% of Black families. The real estate versus stock market conversation is one that you'll hear about. A lot of people feel very strongly. They're like, no, I'm not going to invest in the stock market. I don't trust it. However, the thing about the stock market is historically, since the beginning of tracking the stock market, it has always gone up. Yes, it will have times like this year where it will go down, but ultimately it gains way more than it loses. Um, you will have people who will say, okay, well, I am only going to buy real estate. I'll buy up as much real estate as I can. And that's also a valid way to make wealth because it is a safer investment, meaning that it's not as volatile up and down like the stock market is. When we talk about the racial wealth gap, we also need to understand that there is a discrepancy between how much we understand and use financial skills in comparison to white families and Asian American families. FINRA, you may have heard of, is the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and they have a financial literacy quiz on their website. If you just Google FINRA financial literacy quiz, you'll find it. It's 7 questions right now, 7 multiple choice questions. You don't have to sign up for anything to take it. And there are other financial literacy quizzes online. But with that quiz, what they have found is that Asian American and white test takers tend to score higher than Hispanic and Black test takers. And it's a significant difference too. I think they get like 3 questions more than we do on average. So at the bottom of this slide, I included the first question on the quiz. And that is, suppose you have $100 in a savings account earning 2% interest a year. After 5 years, how much would you have? And they're not asking for a specific amount. They just want to know, is it more than, the same as, less than 102, or if you don't know. I will be transparent. I was not good at math growing up. And before I got into finance, I would have seen this question and I would have had absolutely no clue. And a lot of people have absolutely no clue. What I will say, if you're not sure of the answer, if your account is earning 2% interest a year, in the first year, it will earn $2. So you'll have 102. And then after that, you would have an additional 2% added on to your $102. And then from there, an additional 2% added on to your 104 and however many cents. And so after 5 years, you will have 110, just over $110. And so the answer is more than 102. But this is just to highlight that we don't necessarily know things that others do and that they are using to their advantage. And we deserve the same. So, how did we get here? Well, very long story short, racism and socioeconomic and political disadvantages. That's how we ended up here. Um, Way back in the day, our ancestors in Africa had their own socioeconomic strata, and there were various forms of wealth. There were people who had and people who did not have, and then slavery happened. And we, as Black people, our bodies became a form of wealth used by slave owners to then amass the money that they have amassed and passed on generationally. After slavery, even when we were granted policies and land, there had been reversals of that. Over time, there has been manipulation of the housing market that has put us at a disadvantage. Banking discrimination is also one of the reasons why there is this discrepancy. The FDIC insures the money in bank accounts, in some bank accounts. The major companies like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, all of them, they are FDIC insured. When I talk about underbanked and unbanked people, many Black and brown people are underbanked and unbanked, meaning their accounts, if they have accounts at all, are not in institutions that are FDIC insured. Some people don't even have checking accounts, don't have savings accounts. And also, as Black and brown people, we are underrepresented in higher paying jobs and overrepresented in lower paying jobs. So that's why we are experiencing the wealth gap that we are. And because it has not changed for such a long period of time, what that says to me is that not enough is being done to improve the financial literacy and also to give us an equal opportunity in order to move forward. So, talking about race and money and slavery is difficult. So, a reminder to take a deep breath. I'm also going to take a sip of water. I just realized I'm doing a lot of green. It's a lot of green. I don't usually do it. Oh my gosh, money. Wow. Okay, so let's move on. Let's talk about financial trauma. So I want to make it clear that trauma is not the same thing as PTSD. People think that it's the same, but PTSD is a specific diagnosis given by a mental health provider after you have experienced a traumatic event. If you are experiencing a certain number of symptoms over a certain period of time and it is impacting your life. So PTSD is very specific, but you can have trauma, you can be traumatized and not have PTSD. Trauma is our response to a terrible event happening. It can be an emotional response, a behavioral response, or a mix of the two. Financial stress is different from trauma. I would say that more people experience financial stress than they do trauma. Financial stress is relatively common. I see it every single time gas prices go up and we have to pay $50 to fill our tank. I see it every time grocery prices go up and people start to complain and blame the government. Those are examples of stress. So I know now with inflation, we are experiencing financial stress because our dollar is not going as far as it used to. And that is a stressful thing and it's valid. But when it comes to trauma, that means financially, you experience some kind of money event that was terrible, horrible, traumatic. And in response to that, you are experiencing things like nightmares or complete avoidance, avoiding thinking about the event, thinking about money, avoiding your feelings about it. So, for instance, we may see people who use substances as a way to escape. Alcohol, marijuana tend to be the go tos. Having ongoing fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame, or a combination of all of those, having negative thinking, being estranged. So, for instance, if the terrible financial event happened in your family, maybe distancing yourself from your family members. You can also find people who are easily startled, are irritable, hypervigilant, meaning they're always kind of on the lookout for anything that may harm them, and engaging in self destructive or reckless behavior. The thing about financial trauma is that it can be generational and it can also be systemic. It can be relational, it can be societal. So, for instance, when I think about financially traumatic events, the most recent one that I can think of is COVID-19. That was a financially traumatic event for lots of people. A lot of people lost their jobs. And if you can relate, if you were financially impacted by COVID, you can leave a comment in the chat and you can see that you are not alone. Um, I know during the height of the pandemic, during the shutdown, at that time, I was helping my patients' parents with finding housing or being able to stay in their homes, with being able to afford to feed their children because they had lost their jobs. On the flip side, what I did notice is that my wealthier families were doing fine. I will never forget the conversation that I had with one family who said that they were riding out the shutdown at their beach home. And I responded and I said, "Oh, that sounds nice." Meanwhile, I'm trying to help other people with being able to keep a roof over their head and food on their table. Um, but yes, the pandemic was definitely a financially traumatic event that a lot of people are still crawling their way out of. Divorce can also be a financially traumatic event. If you are going through a divorce, you have lawyers' fees, and also there may be alimony involved and splitting of assets that can be traumatic. I did want to mention financial abuse and financial infidelity. Those are terms that we use as financial therapists that a lot of people are not quite familiar with. But once I start to describe it, you'll be like, oh, yeah, I know what that is. Financial abuse is when one person abuses another through money. So, for instance, it is very, very common to see in survivors of domestic violence and inter-partner violence, where one person dictates how much money they can have, if they can work, how much they can work. You can also see financial abuse with adult children and elderly parents, where they take their elderly parents' check and they spend it versus using it to care for their family member. And financial infidelity is typically seen in couples where one partner is hiding what they're doing with money from the other person. So, for instance, hiding how they're spending money, hiding a gambling problem, hiding how much debt they have. Those are examples of financial infidelity. Other things like growing up and just seeing your parents argue about money, or seeing how stressed out your parents were, or seeing that you had a workaholic parent who was always gone and made a big deal about how much money they made. those can also be financially traumatic events. So, what does that end up looking like? Well, if you experience a financially traumatic event, if you have financial trauma, you may find yourself doing one of the following five things. So, we have three on this slide, there are two on the next one. You may be financially avoidant. And I will admit, again, transparency, I was financially avoidant for a really long time until I became interested and I got to a place where I was willing and open to learning. That can look like not checking your accounts, not opening bills, distracting yourself or self soothing so that you don't have to think about it or you don't have to face it. Financial hypervigilance is kind of on the other end of the extreme, where you are always checking your accounts. You always know what your balance is. You always know what you owe. You are repeatedly running the numbers to make sure that you know what's happening, even though the numbers have not changed. You can also have poor financial boundaries. So, a financial boundary is how you set limits for your money, both for yourself as well as for other people. What are the limits that you place on yourself? What are the limits you place on other people? So, for instance, if someone has poor financial boundaries, they may lend money and not know that they are probably not going to get it back. And they don't necessarily have it to lend, but they lend it anyway. Overspending on family and friends, even if you have not necessarily budgeted for it. So, for instance, we're coming up on the holiday season. I see a lot of people who are going into debt to have great, grand, elaborate decorations and spend money on all of the kids in the family, the extended family, nieces, nephews, even though they don't have the money necessarily to do so, and having a hard time saying no. So I included bottomless mimosa brunch because I love me a brunch. And it is difficult to say no to things that you enjoy. But if you are not doing so, you're not honoring the boundaries that you should have. You can also see overspending. Overspending is really very common, particularly because of our access to credit cards. And so we often see people who are using credit cards knowing that they don't have the cash to cover the credit card use, or spending more than you make and regularly going over your budget, even if you're trying to budget. Underspending is something that is not talked about nearly enough. I think because people don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing, but it is. That is specifically hoarding your savings, not spending on things that you want or that you like despite having enough money. And people who are financially traumatized might do that because they have learned that money is a scarcity. When we talk about scarcity mindset, that's where that comes in. And so they think that they have to hold on to money because it may go somewhere. And they may have seen money go somewhere in the past. So, another deep breath for us all. Talking about trauma is a lot, I would admit. So, how do we heal from this? How do we heal as a collective? How do we heal individually? The first thing that you want to do is you want to acknowledge that you want and deserve better for yourself. And starting to talk about it is really key. I mean, when we think about like the 12-step programs, they talk about the first step being acknowledging that there is a problem, and then you start to talk about it. Once you start to talk about it, you'll get a better idea of what your experience is and what are some of the things that may have contributed to it, as well as some of the things that maybe work in your favor. I encourage people to dream and to set goals. I think that that is an important piece that a lot of people are missing. If you take nothing away from this, I want you to please spend some time thinking about what you want your life to look like. and then set goals from there. So, for instance, I know of someone who has not traveled internationally and she wants to go overseas. And so I said to her, that's a great dream. That's a great goal. Let's talk about it some more. Where would you go? What country would you go to? What activities would you do? Okay, so how can we get there? How much money do you have right now? How much money will you need? When we start to set goals for ourselves, we are able to tap into that intrinsic motivation to achieve those goals. And it makes it more meaningful. I mean, I would much rather spend my time dreaming about the Maldives and planning for a trip to the Maldives versus like, oh my gosh, this is a budget and 2 + 2 = 4. No, I'll do all of that boring stuff because I want to get to the Maldives. You also want to think about your money beliefs and where they've come from. What are the things that you think about money? So, for instance, common ones: money is bad, being rich is selfish, understanding money is hard. I used to have that belief. It will always be like this. People who look like me or who live where I live don't have a lot of money. And that may be true, but does it have to remain true? My worth comes from what I own, what people see me driving, what people see me wearing. Challenge those beliefs and ask yourself, is it true? And is it helpful? And be gentle with yourself. Give yourself grace. And remember that it took time for us to get to where we are. And so it can take some time to recover. When I think about financial health, I think about three things. So, having basic financial literacy, experiencing healthy emotions towards money. So, you're not obsessive about it, you're not thinking a lot about it, you're not worshiping it or worshiping the idea of it. And on the flip side, you're not afraid of it, you're not running away from it, you're not anxious about it, as well as being able to confidently manage your finances. So I have a breakdown over the next 2 slides of the things that I consider to be essential when we are practicing basic financial literacy. These are the things that I wish that we could have been taught in school, but we were not. And so here we are. Understanding what you earn and how much you owe, looking at your paycheck stub and understanding the numbers on it. Paying yourself first. That means when you are paid, you immediately put money towards your bills. You need to be able to eat and to live, but also money goes to your savings and to your investments before you spend. Some people have multiple accounts to make that happen and to make sure that they're not pulling from accounts where they shouldn't be. Having an emergency fund. Ideally, that would be 3 to 6 months of your expenses, 3 to 6 months worth of your expenses. So if your expenses are $5,000 a month, that's your expenses. I'm not talking about your trips to wherever you go for your brunch. I'm not talking about how much you spend on your shoes. I'm talking about expenses, what you need to live. So if you spend $5,000 on expenses for your family in a month, 3 months would be $15,000. You want to build up so you have that cushion in the event that you need it in the future. If you don't get to that, at the very least, have a cushion of $1,000. Most Americans cannot cover a $1,000 bill. And being able to budget. There are different types of budgets. You don't have to call it a budget. You can call it whatever you want to, a spending plan, my get to Maldives plan, whatever the case is. Also, tracking your spending. You can do that on paper and pencil. You can do it in a spreadsheet. There are apps that can help you with tracking how much money you're doing by connecting your credit cards and your bank cards to the app. For instance, Mint is a really popular one. Understanding your credit score and what goes into your credit score. So the two biggest contributors to your credit score are you paying your bills on time? your debts on time, and as well as how much do you owe. Do you owe a lot? Do you not owe a lot? The quickest way to increase your credit score is to pay your bills, pay your debts. And I know that sounds easy, but it's not. It is very difficult for a lot of people. Debt payoff, there are various ways that you can do that, and you can research which one would work best for you, as well as getting some extra help. And insurance, we need to cover ourselves and we need to cover our future. When I talk about insurance, people ask my opinion on life insurance. And life insurance, the life insurance policy that is beneficial for most people is a low cost term life insurance plan. I just want to end off by talking about DMX as an example for estate planning. I talked about estate planning early on, and we're almost out of time. So the easiest way that you can start on your estate plan is to do a POD with your bank. If you have a bank account, if you have a checking account, a savings account with the bank, chances are your bank allows you to put a beneficiary, and POD stands for payable on death. So if I were to die today, God forbid, knock on wood, my child is the beneficiary on all of my accounts, and we don't have to go through court. I've died, they'll give him the money. DMX is a good case study for us to use because he had a multi-million-dollar career and was the father of 17 children. I don't know how he remembered all of their names. I have a hard time with one sometimes. But he did not have a will, and he did not have much money. He had less than $1 million in worth when he died. What ended up happening is that his family went to court. So his ex-wife, 3 of their sons, his fiance, who he was engaged to when he died, her daughter, and another daughter of his, they all went to court to try to get control of the money. And ultimately, it went to his ex-wife and the 3 sons about 6 months after he had passed. A financial therapist can also be really helpful to you, and we are trained to talk about all of these things, as well as how your mental health may be impacting your finances. For instance, people with ADHD have a hard time kind of keeping track of everything that's going on, and we can help with that. People with bipolar disorder may tend to spend a lot of money when they're manic, and we can help with that as well. Okay, so I am at the end. I have resources, the books that I like, as well as websites, podcasts, and so on. I really want to hear from you. Are there any questions as we wrap up? Oh, Pamela, I love that. So you were talking about one of those scripts. We call them scripts, the sayings that you have growing up. It's what goes on in our home stays in our home. And yes, we definitely need to change that, because if there are things going on in the home that are harmful, other people need to know about it so that we can get the help that we need. All right. Well, if there are no questions, you can feel free to reach out to me if you'd like. And thank you so much for having me.